So we're going to start off by looking at monomers and polymers, and then we're going to finish off by looking at condensation and hydrolysis reactions, along with some exam questions. Okay, so this is what the spec says, and we're going to be covering every point from the spec. I'm going to be constantly referring back to the spec just so we have an idea of what we actually need to know. So first of all, the key definitions. Now, these are key definitions that you literally need to know. They could come up in an exam as a 1 marker. So first of all, monomers. These are smaller units from which larger molecules are made. What does that mean? Well, if I was to model that, we would have something like this, and this is a chain of circles, and each individual unit is known as a monomer. Okay, and as you can see, this is sort of a big chain, and each unit in this chain is known as a monomer. Now, in terms of the definition, this is literally what the spec says. The highlighted part is what the spec says. So that's the part which you need to know. Okay, and then polymers is literally the opposite. The polymer word is referring to this whole structure itself. So this whole structure is the polymer. Okay, now I've just referred to that circles just to help you understand what we're actually talking about. But it could be with anything. We're going to have a look at some biological molecules in the next few sessions that are made up of monomers that look to form polymers. Okay, so if we look at this chain as well, we've got squares, circles, squares, circles. Now in this chain, as you can see, we have two different types of monomers. We have a square and a circle. However, the whole structure itself is still known as a polymer. Okay, so basically, if there are two definitions that you need to be aware of, it is these two: monomers definition, polymers definition. I've seen it come up in exams as simple 1 markers. Again, you don't want to be losing marks on simple, easy questions that you can just learn. Okay, so that's what monomers and polymers are. Now, you also need to know some examples of monomers and polymers. Now, each of these monomers and each of these polymers, we are going to be going into more detail over the next few sessions. But just to give you an idea of what they actually are. So polymers, we know that they are the long chains. Okay, so if I was to model starch, for example, so we've got starch, we're going to model starch, and I'm going to model each of the monomers like this. So this is starch. We know that starch is a polymer. Okay, so this is starch. Okay, now each individual one of these will have a monomer. Okay, so these are each individual monomers, and each monomer will have a name. Okay, so each of these monomers will have a name. So this is a monosaccharide. Okay, because starch is a carbohydrate. Okay, now if I was to model amino acids, for example, amino acids are monomers. Amino acids might be square shaped. Okay, now this is the purpose of this is just to help you understand what actually is going on. But we can model amino acids like this. Okay, and each of these squares will be an amino acid. So we've got an amino acid. Okay, and the whole chain will form a protein. Okay, because a sequence of amino acids is known as a protein. Okay, and the same goes for nucleotides. Now, I've put these 3 examples of polymers over here because in the next lesson, we're going to be looking at carbohydrates. And carbohydrates, well, it can be known as starch, there's cellulose in plants, and glycogen. All of these are polymers of monosaccharides. Okay, saccharide just means sugar. Okay, so the spec has outlined these examples of monomers. Again, you could get an exam question which just says state an example of a monomer. It would be at the start of an exam paper just because it's slightly easier. But again, you don't want to be losing marks on easy questions. Okay, so far what we've looked at is what monomers and polymers are. Monomers are small units from which larger molecules are made. Polymers are molecules that are made from many of these small repeating units which are joined together. We've had a look at some examples of monomers. So we've got monosaccharides, amino acids, and nucleotides, and we've got some examples of polymers, such as starch, cellulose, and glycogen. Now, you've probably be wondering, we've got this long polymer over here. How are these bonds, how are these small monomers actually joined together? Okay, so we've got many repeating units, but how are they actually joined together? Well, this is actually called a chemical bond. Okay, now each of these monomers are joined by a chemical bond. And there are many different types of chemical bonds that you need to be aware about throughout biological molecules. And we'll have a look at them each in a different lesson. But for example, if I was to give you an example, um, we've got carbohydrates. In carbohydrates, we would have a glycosidic bond present. Okay, the name of the bond is called glycosidic. Okay, in proteins, we've got many amino acids which are joined together, such as this, and the bond here is called a peptide bond. Okay, and so on. I'll just give these two as examples. Okay, now how do these chemical bonds actually form? Okay, I'm just going to get rid of my writing here, just so we can see um, the writing on the slide. Okay. Okay. So how do these bonds actually form? Okay, well, these bonds actually form via a condensation reaction. Now, you probably have known from GCSE what a condensation reaction is. A condensation reaction is just the formation of a chemical bond releasing a molecule of water. And I've got the definition here as well. Okay, so when two monomers are joined together, a chemical bond is formed and a molecule of water is released. Now, if we have a look at this example again, we've got a polymer here with many monomers. This chemical bond, in order for this chemical bond to form, these chemical bonds to form, a condensation reaction must occur. Condensation reaction must occur between many monomers in order for that bond to form. And once that bond has formed, a molecule of water will be released in the process. Okay, so that's what condensation reaction is. Again, learn this definition. You don't want to be losing easy marks right at the start of biology. So when two monomers are joined together, we will have a look at more examples throughout the lesson. But for now, when two monomers are joined together, a chemical bond is formed and a molecule of water is released in the process. Okay, now if we can go from monomers to polymers, we can also go from polymers back to monomers, and that requires a different reaction. So if I model it over here, we know that if we add, actually I'll write it down here, if we add two monomers together, that will form the starting of a polymer. And because this bond is forming, a molecule of water is being released. So a molecule of water is released. And because a molecule of water is released, we're going to add an H2O in this reaction. Now, because we form this sort of starting chain of a polymer, you call it a dimer, we can also break this dimer to form its monomers back again. So this pair of circles, we can break it to form the individual circles. And that's known as a hydrolysis reaction. Okay, and a hydrolysis reaction is basically when you use this molecule of water, to break this bond in order to form the individual monomers once again. For example, if we had our polymer, let's say that this was starch, okay, and we added 3 molecules of water to this, we would break the 3 bonds. Okay, we would break this bond, and this bond. And if we break the 3 bonds, we would be left with 3 individual monomers. Okay, now the way to remember this, well, think about it, condensation should be rather simple. If something's condensing, what is being released? Whenever gas is condensing, water is being released. So just think about it as that. Hydrolysis, you're going to be using the word hydrolyze a lot, and hydrolysis means breaking. Lysis means to break, and hydro means water. So you could think of this as lysis as breaking. So we've got lysis to break and hydro water. Okay, so the splitting of a chemical bond using water. That's an alternative way you can remember a hydrolysis reaction by. So breaking a chemical bond using water. Okay, just remember in a condensation reaction, if one molecule of water is formed, that means one bond has formed, and you will also need to name the bond, which we will have a look at in a further lesson. You have glycosidic bonds, peptide bonds, ester bonds. There's many types of bonds in biology. Okay, now we're going to have a look at some examples now. We've looked at monomers and polymers, and we've looked at condensation and hydrolysis reactions. We're going to have a look at how we can actually form those bonds releasing the molecule of water. And we're going to start off by looking at amino acids. Okay, now this structure we will come across again. You will need to know the structure for A-level biology. I've seen questions which have asked draw the structure of an amino acid out. But for now, just know that this is the structure. We will have a look at how a molecule of water is released during the process. Okay, so this structure I'm just going to redraw. Okay, we've got, this is an amino acid, by the way. So amino acid is a monomer. And remember, many monomers come together to form a polymer. So we've got this monomer. Okay, we've got this monomer. What's actually going to happen is that, remember, a polymer is made from many monomers. Many amino acids come together to form a protein. Okay, and we will look at this later, but the definition of a protein is basically the sequence of amino acids. Okay, now if this is one amino acid, clearly in order to start forming the protein, we're going to need more than one amino acid. Okay, so I'm just going to draw another amino acid here. Okay, we've got another amino acid. Okay, now where can you see a molecule of water being released in the process? If these two were to combine, how can a molecule of water be released? Well, if you have a look over here, we can see this bond over here. We can see that there's two H's and an O. And if that was to combine, we would find that the H2O would be released in the process. Okay, so if we were to combine this now, we would have CCO or H and H. So this was the original amino acid, the first amino acid that we had, but we've released the OH and the H from the other amino acid. So now this bond is directly bonded to the nitrogen from the other amino acid. Okay, because we released the H2O, and the nitrogen is bonding to the hydrogen, and that's bonded to its normal carbon with the R group and carboxyl group. Okay, now this is the dimer that we have formed, and we have released water in the process. Okay, so what's actually gone on over here is that water has been released in the process. Two amino acids have joined together, a peptide bond has been formed, and this is a condensation reaction. So how would we explain this in words? Well, over here, what we can say is that a condensation reaction has occurred. A condensation reaction has occurred. And what else has occurred is that molecule of water has been released. Now, once that molecule of water has been released, we can say that a chemical bond has been formed, which is a peptide bond. Now, once that chemical bond has been formed, we have formed a dipeptide. And all a dipeptide means is that two amino acids have just been combined together. Okay, so that's the condensation reaction example of what actually is occurring in amino acids. Okay, obviously we will look at this in more details, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what actually is going on. We've got two amino acids. Obviously, this will occur across many amino acids to form a polymer. This is not a polymer. This is known as a dimer. A polymer is made of many repeating units of amino acids, but this is how a condensation reaction actually occurs. Okay, now I'm going to show you another example, and this is with alpha glucose, which is against a monomer which we will come across in a later lesson, in fact, in our next lesson. You need to know the structure of alpha glucose. Again, I'll mention this more at the start of next lesson, but a condensation reaction occurs between many monomers. Now, if we were to draw another monomer for this out, okay, so we've got the oxygen here, H here, OH, and H, and OH. Now, as you can see, I've drawn another monomer out. This is our first monomer, and this is our second monomer. What's actually going to occur in this reaction? Well, we know that it's a condensation reaction, and whenever we're talking about a condensation reaction, we're going to form a chemical bond. We're going to release a molecule of water in the process. Okay, so as you can see over here, we're going to take one of the OH and one of the H's. Okay, we're going to take one of the OH and one of the H's from the other alpha glucose. Okay, and that means that we have formed our molecule of water. And now we can just combine both of these together. Okay, so we're going to have the H, OH as normal, oxygen as normal. We're going to have the H as normal, but instead over here, because we've released a molecule of water, we're just going to be left with the O over here because we've got the O from here. Okay, and this is just going to be normal. Okay, we're just going to have the normal H over here, O over here. We're going to have the H, and we're going to have the OH. Obviously, this will repeat across many repeating units, not just two. But the idea over here is that a molecule of water is being released in the process. Okay, so we've got two alpha glucose. They form this bond. Now, this bond is called a glycosidic bond. Okay, and a molecule of water has been released in the process. Okay, so now before we move on to exam questions, this is everything that you need to know about the first area from the spec. Okay, and it's condensation and hydrolysis reactions. So if I just go back and just go over everything that we have looked at today, monomers and polymers, key definitions that you need to understand. Monomers, these are the small repeating units from which larger molecules are made, and the polymers are referring to the whole structure which are made from monomers, joined together via condensation reaction, forming a chemical bond in the process. Now, we've looked at some examples of monomers because the spec stated some examples of monomers, and we've also looked at some examples of polymers. And we've realized that in order for many monomers to join together to form a polymer, there has to be a chemical bond which keeps these monomers joined together. And that's what we looked at. We looked at condensation and hydrolysis reactions. Condensation reactions are the main reaction which allows the chemical bond between many monomers to form, releasing a molecule of water in the process. Remember, condensation is when the gas condenses into a liquid, and the hydrolysis reaction, which means lysis to break, and hydro, water, the splitting of a chemical bond using water. Okay, and this is when you are going from a larger polymer into its individual constituent monomers. And each molecule of water which is used will break one chemical bond. And then we had a look at some examples. We first looked at amino acids, and we had the general structure of an amino acid. We drew the general structure of an amino acid out, and we combined two of those amino acids together. And then we realized that over here, a molecule of water is being released. And because that molecule of water is being released, we're forming this bond over here. The carbon is bonded directly to the nitrogen. And we've released a molecule of water in the process. This is sort of your explanation as to what is actually occurring. Condensation reaction, molecule of water is released, chemical bond, in this case a peptide bond is formed, and the whole structure, because it's between two amino acids, it's called a dipeptide. And then we had a look at an example with alpha glucose. Okay, when two monomers of alpha glucose are present next to each other, we can see that a molecule of water can be released, and then this bond will form directly with the oxygen. And this bond, which is formed, has a different name. It's called a glycosidic bond, but the way that has formed that bond is the exact same because it's used a molecule of water in the process. Okay, two alpha glucose joined together, glycosidic bond formed, releasing a molecule of water in a condensation reaction.